Strasbourg, 1518. People begin to dance and cannot stop. You've probably heard how it ended, dancers dropping dead, as many as 15 a day. Why would a city cure dancing with more dancing? And that death toll, where does it come from? This is the story of the stages, the band that came too late, and a shrine at Saverne. Early August 1518. In the market squares of Strasbourg, carpenters are building stages. Rough timber hammered together in the heat, the ordinary work of ordinary men, done at the order of the city council. The stages are not for a festival. The city has a problem it cannot solve. For weeks, its citizens have been dancing in the streets, and they cannot make themselves stop. Understand that plainly, because it is what most people get wrong about this episode. The dancing plague was not a sickness with a fever and a rash. It was not the bubonic plague, the Black Death, returned. The word plague here is just the name we have given the event, an outbreak of compulsive, involuntary dancing that swept through a real city in a real summer. People danced who did not want to dance and could not stop, and no doctor then or since has been able to say for certain why. So the council has made a decision. It has cleared out the guild halls, it has raised these wooden platforms in the horse market and the grain market, and it has brought in musicians, and it is paying them by the day to keep the dancers going. The official position of the city of Strasbourg, ratified by its own physicians, is that the cure for the dancing is more dancing. It is the kind of decision that, written down, looks like a mistake in the record. And the strange part, the thing this entire account turns on, is that it was not a mistake of stupidity. It was a careful decision, reasoned out by the most educated men in the city from the best science they had. That is what makes it worth an hour of your attention. Not that they were fools. That they were not. Within weeks, the stages were full, and the city had made it worse. To understand how the most careful minds in that room talked themselves into this, you have to go back 3 weeks, to the day there was only one woman in one street. Mid-July 1518. The worst summer anyone in Strasbourg can remember. A woman steps out into a narrow street and begins to dance. There is no music, there is no festival, no wedding, no reason anyone watching can see. She simply dances, alone, in the heat. And she does not stop. She dances into the evening. She dances the next day, and the day after that. By the accounts that come down to us, she danced for somewhere between 4 and 6 days without rest. Try to hold that for a moment. Not an hour, not an evening of celebration. Days. Sleeping little, eating little, her body kept in motion past the point where motion is anything but agony. Whatever was happening to this woman, it was not joy. It was not a party. It looked, to the people around her, like something had taken hold of her body and would not let go. And here, this early, is the one idea I need you to carry through the rest of this account. Everything we are about to follow, the woman, the doctors, the stages, the deaths everyone remembers, reaches us through papers. Papers written at very different times. Some during that summer, in that city, by people who were there. Some set down decades, even centuries later, by people who were not. The single most useful question you can ask about any detail here is not, is it dramatic? It is, who wrote this down and how long after it happened? Keep that question in your hand. It is the one that solves the mystery. So, what can we actually say about that first week? This. Within those same few days, the woman was no longer alone. By the careful reckoning that survives, more than 30 others had begun to dance the same way, and again, not in any way that looked like celebration. The better attested descriptions are of movement that was convulsive and spasmodic, closer to a seizure than to a dance, bodies that seemed to be moving against the will of those trapped inside them. It is worth being careful, even with the small details. That famous date you may have read, the 14th of July, comes from a chronicle tradition, not from a register anyone actually kept that day. The precise head count comes down to us through a single historian's reading of one family's private record. So we say what the evidence will bear and no more. One woman in mid-July, and within roughly a week, dozens. By the end of July, this was no longer something a city could treat as one woman's private madness. There were too many of them, in too many streets for too long. And when an event grows too large to ignore, the men in charge are forced to do the one thing that turns a strange happening into a documented one. They have to decide what to call it. Late July 1518. The city's leaders turn to the people whose job it is to know, the Guild of Physicians. We should be honest about what we can and cannot see in this room. No individual doctor is named in the surviving record. They appear as a body, a guild, delivering a collective ruling. The one official whose name reaches us is the city's chancellor, Sebastian Brandt, a man you may already know because 24 years earlier he had written one of the most famous books of the age, a satire called The Ship of Fools. It is through the records kept under Brandt that the physician's verdict comes down to us at all. And this is the moment the legend usually gets told as medieval superstition. It was not. The physicians did not blame a curse. They did not blame the devil. They did not reach for witchcraft or possession. They examined what was in front of them, reasoned from the best medical science of their century, and delivered a verdict that was entirely natural. A diagnosis a modern doctor would recognize as a diagnosis, even if the content is wrong. The dancing, they ruled, and here the actual words survive, was a natural disease which comes from overheated blood. Sit with that phrase, because the entire catastrophe is folded inside it. If the sickness is heat trapped in the body, blood running too hot, pooling, unable to escape, then the treatment writes itself. You do not cool such a patient by sitting them down in a dark room. Trapped heat has to come out. The excess has to be burned off. The body has to be worked, and worked hard, until the surplus is spent and balance returns. Read the verdict, and the cure is already inside it. They are the same sentence. Once you accept that the problem is overheated blood, the stages in the market square stop looking like madness. They become the obvious, responsible, medically indicated next step. We will get to those stages. But the verdict only sounds like foolishness to us, standing 500 years downstream of it. In the summer of 1518, it was textbook, the careful, expert, correct for its time application of a model that had stood for over 1,000 years. And to understand why the cleverest men in Strasbourg looked at people dancing themselves toward collapse and decided the answer was to help them dance harder, we have to step back, just once, into the world that made "dance it out" sound like medicine. To a physician in 1518, the human body was a balance of 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was these four held in proportion, the right amounts, in the right places, in balance. Sickness was one of them, in excess. Too much of a humour, pooling somewhere it should not, throwing the whole system out of true. This is the model we call Galenic medicine, after the Greek physician Galen. And it was not a fringe idea or a folk belief. It was the foundation of educated European medicine, taught in universities for well over 1,000 years. To train as a doctor was to learn this system. Within it, the logic was airtight. If a patient was flushed, agitated, hot to the touch, unable to keep still, then the obvious culprit was blood, the hot and wet humour, clearly present in dangerous excess. And the remedy for an excess of any humour was always the same in principle: get rid of the surplus, drain it, or sweat it, or burn it off until proportion was restored. So when the physicians of Strasbourg looked at people who could not stop moving, who were hot and frantic and exhausting themselves, they did not see something supernatural, and they did not throw up their hands. They saw, as clearly as if it were written in a book, a case of too much hot blood demanding release. And the prescription that followed: let them dance, let them sweat, give them room and a rhythm, and let the body spend its dangerous surplus, was not a wild guess by frightened men. It was the disciplined application of the most respected medical framework in the Western world. This is the part of the story that matters most, and the part nearly every retelling gets wrong. The men who built those stages were not idiots, and they were not cruel. They reasoned carefully, from genuine expertise, toward a conclusion their entire science endorsed. The horror of this story is not that the authorities were stupid. The horror is that they were competent, that they did everything right by the knowledge they had, and it was catastrophically, fatally wrong anyway. And they were not reasoning in calm conditions. They were reasoning inside a city pushed nearly to breaking. The years just before that summer had been brutal across the Upper Rhine. Harvest after harvest had failed. The price of rye, the bread of the poor, the one commodity that stood between an ordinary family and starvation, had climbed to the highest it had been in more than a generation. On top of the hunger came the diseases that hunger invites: smallpox, the terrifying new arrival of syphilis sweeping through Europe, leprosy, and the ever-present shadow of the actual plague. And the countryside around the city was politically raw. Only the year before, a peasant conspiracy had stirred through Alsace, the kind of unrest that frightened every city council in the region. These were people who had been hungry and afraid for years. Their bodies were worn down, and their nerves were worn down with them. And woven through all of it was a saint, St. Vitus, a boy martyr of legend, so much legend, in fact, that historians cannot even fix the dates of his life, if he lived at all. But by the early 16th century, the people of these lands believed St. Vitus held a very specific and very frightening power. They believed he could afflict you with a compulsion to dance, and that he could also, if appeased, take it away. To dance uncontrollably in this world was not only an illness of the body, it could be a mark of divine displeasure, a curse from a saint who had reached into you and who now had to be answered. Hold those three forces together, because they are about to collide. A body understood as overheated blood that must be made to exert itself. A population starved and frightened and worn to the bone, and a shared, bone-deep belief in a saint who could seize a human being and make them dance. That is the world the verdict came out of. And now, on that verdict, the council acts. Acting on the physician's verdict, the council does exactly what the diagnosis demands, and the scale of it is the first surprise. This was not a couple of musicians sent into a square. It was an organized civic program. The council cleared out the guild halls, the largest indoor spaces in the city, to make open floor for dancing. It ordered wooden stages raised in the horse market and in the grain market, and it brought in professional musicians, drummers, fiddlers, pipers, horn players, and put them on the city's payroll, paid by the day, to keep the rhythm going so the afflicted would keep moving. Picture the commitment in that. Carpenters paid, halls requisitioned, musicians hired. A budget line in a city that could barely feed itself, spent on making the sick dance. The reasoning held all the way down. If the cure is exertion, then the more the afflicted move, the faster the bad blood burns away. And surrounding them with healthy hired dancers and a steady beat would help carry the weak ones along until the fever spent itself. It did the opposite of everything they intended. The dancing did not burn out. It spread. A Strasbourg family's own chronicle, written close to the time, records how far it went. Within weeks, it says, more than 400 had been caught up in the dancing. Now, that figure deserves real caution, and notice that we are already practicing the discipline this whole video is about. The 400 rests on a single household's record. The careful range modern scholars give runs anywhere from about 50 to 400, and we cannot narrow it further. But hold even the low end of that range in your mind. 50 men and women, or more, dancing against their will to exhaustion in the public markets of a major European city, on stages that city had built, to music that city was paying for. And here is the cruelest part, the part that points at what this affliction might really have been. The historian who has looked most closely at the role of the music in this episode makes the point flatly. The music the council deployed as a therapy did not calm the afflicted. It pulled more of them in. Every drumbeat the city paid for was, it seems, helping the dancing recruit. The crowds came to watch, and watching, some of them began to move. The cure was not failing quietly off to the side. The cure was the engine. The cure was the disease. They paid for it by the day. By early August, the council looks at hundreds dancing on the stages it built, and it does the only thing left. It reverses course completely. It bans them. Public dancing and public music are forbidden across the city. And here we arrive at the single most solid object in this entire account, the one piece of paper that was actually there, written down at the time in that summer, surviving in the city's own records. If you remember one document from this video, remember this one, because we are going to keep coming back to it. What is remarkable about it is how dry it is. After weeks of stages and hired drummers and hundreds of bodies convulsing in the markets, after a civic emergency unlike anything the council had ever faced, the order that survives reads like the work of a careful, slightly weary clerk. Honourable persons, it allows, may still dance at a wedding or at the celebration of a young priest's first mass in their own houses, but only using stringed instruments. And then comes the line that tells you everything about the register of the real contemporary record. They are, it says, on their conscience not to use tambourines and drums. No tambourines, no drums. A later account adds two further details: that breaking the ban carried a fine of 30 shillings, and that it was to hold until St. Michael's Day, the 29th of September. That is the document. That is what the city of Strasbourg, in the middle of the worst crisis in living memory, took the trouble to write down and preserve. A careful rule about which instruments were permitted at a wedding. You can hear in it the logic of the entire response. The drum was the engine, so ban the drum. Allow the gentle strings, forbid the driving beat. It is precise, it is reasonable. It is the sound of a government trying, sincerely, to manage a catastrophe. And now look at what is not on it. This page records, in fussy and specific detail, exactly which instruments were and were not permitted to play. It says nothing, not one word, about anyone dying. The strongest, surest, most contemporary document we possess from that entire summer is completely silent on the single detail that every modern retelling treats as the whole point. So hold that, because we are coming back to it. The page that was actually there, written by people who were actually present, does not mention a single death. If the best evidence we have says nothing about anyone dying, then where exactly did the dying come from? But before we follow the silence on this page, I want to show you what the very same legend did to a different absence, to the very first dancer, the woman in the street. Because the way her legend grew and the way the deaths appeared turn out to be the same machine working twice. We started this account with a woman in a street, and most retellings give her a name. They call her Frau Trophäa. That name is not invented. It really does appear in the old chronicles. In most of the accounts that survive, the first dancer is named Trophäa or Traufäa. But look closely at what it really is. It is a surname, only a surname. Her first name, the one her family used, the one she answered to, was never written down by anyone. We do not have it, we never will. And in some of the surviving accounts, she is not named at all. She is simply a woman who began to dance. So here is the entire, complete, verified contents of the historical record on the most famous individual in this episode. A last name, attached in some of the chronicles to a woman who danced first. That is it. That is everything. The rest of what you have ever heard about her was added afterward by other hands. Take the most repeated detail, the motive. You will often read that she danced out of spite, to punish or shame her husband. It is a vivid little invention. It gives her a reason, a relationship, an inner life. And it is not from that summer. It comes from Paracelsus, a brilliant, restless, famously abrasive physician who passed through Strasbourg some years after the event and wrote about it roughly 8 years on. The husband, the spite, the marriage as the cause of the dancing. That is one prickly stranger's interpretation of a woman he never met, supplied the better part of a decade after she danced. And the additions keep coming, right up into our own time. In a modern essay about the dancing plague, the first dancer is even given a daughter, a named child, a family relation invented outright, for which there is no contemporary basis whatsoever. It is not a lie, exactly. It is the way a story fills its own gaps. But it has no anchor in anything written at the time. So watch what has happened to this woman across 500 years. We begin with a person who danced, unnamed. A surname survives the century. A hostile stranger supplies a motive. Later writers, needing the account to feel whole, hand her a household, a marriage, a child. Step by step, a person about whom we know almost nothing has been issued a complete biography. not built up from evidence, but filled in from the simple, understandable human wish for the tale to be finished and knowable. This is the machine. There is a small true fact at the centre. A woman danced. Her name may have been Trophea. And around it, layer after layer, the things we wish we knew slowly harden into the things we are sure we know. No one lies. Everyone simply tells the story a little more completely than the last person told it. And if that machine can do this to a single woman, issue her a whole life out of one surviving surname, then it is worth asking, very seriously, what it did to the most famous detail of all. Not a name, the dying. So let us go and look for the deaths. Here is what almost everyone remembers about the dancing plague of 1518, that people danced until they died, that at the height of it, 15 were dropping dead every day, that the streets of Strasbourg filled with corpses who had danced themselves into the grave. So we go to the papers, the contemporary ones, written that summer in that city, the physician's verdict, the council's ban, the records kept under the chancellor's hand. We lay them out and we look for the deaths. They are not there. The 15 a day, the hundreds dead, the bodies in the street, none of it is in the contemporary record. The sources of the city of Strasbourg, written at the time of the events, do not record the number of deaths, or even whether there were any deaths at all. That is not a small gap. That is the most famous fact about this entire event, and the people who were closest to it, who watched it happen, who took the trouble to write down a rule about wedding instruments, they say nothing about it. The page that was actually there is silent, and it is silent because the whole contemporary record is silent. This is the heart of it, not a body count, the absence of one. The most repeated detail about the dancing plague is missing from every document written while it was happening. Which leaves a real question, and it is not a trick. If the deaths are not in the record from 1518, then where exactly did they come from? Before we follow that question out of that summer, the season has one act left to play. The stages had failed, the ban had failed, the dancing went on. And so the city did what frightened people in that world did when medicine reached the end of itself. It turned from the physicians to the saint. Notice the order of that, because it is the opposite of how the legend is usually told. The educated, secular, medical response came first. The religious one came last. Not because the city was superstitious, but because it had tried everything else. A later Strasbourg chronicler tells us that the worst afflicted dancers were gathered up and carried out of the city, roughly 30 miles, to a shrine of St. Vitus near the town of Saverne. There, the account says, they were given small crosses to hold and red shoes to wear, and were led before a carved wooden image of the saint who, in their belief, could both send the dancing and take it away. They had come to beg the one who had cursed them to release them. It is worth being precise about how we know this, because we are about to be very strict about how we know anything. This pilgrimage does not reach us from the city's own summer papers the way the ban does. It comes through a chronicler writing roughly 18 years after the event, a recollection, not a clerk's entry made in the moment. It is well attested, and it almost certainly happened, and it belongs in the account. But it is later testimony, and the discipline of this whole video requires us to hold it exactly as carefully as we are about to hold the deaths, as something written down after the fact, not as a page from that summer. What we can say with confidence is the shape of it. The response that began in the Physicians' Guild with a natural diagnosis and a worldly cure ended at an altar with red shoes and a wooden saint. Medicine first, religion second. That is the documented order, and getting it right matters because the easy version, science versus superstition, the rational doctors against the panicked church, has the whole thing backwards. And then, around the start of September, the dancing faded. About as inexplicably as it had begun, it thinned and slowed and stopped. The entire episode had lasted roughly 2 months. So did the pilgrimage cure it? Here too we have to be honest, and the honest answer is that we cannot say. The fading does line up with the pilgrimage, but it lines up just as neatly with the music ban that came before it, with the cooling of the summer air, and with the plain fact that outbreaks like this one tend, eventually, to exhaust themselves. The dancing subsided after the pilgrimage. That is the most the record will let us claim. After is not because of. And with that, the contemporary event is over. It ends here, at the altar, in early September 1518, and everything we have just walked through is, more or less, everything the people who were there actually wrote down. Every famous detail beyond this point, the count, the motive, and above all the dying, was set on paper later. So now we leave that summer behind for good, and we watch the legend arrive, one source at a time, across the 120 years that follow. So let us do what the whole video has been promising. Let us lay the sources out, not in the order of the events they describe, but in the order they were written. And watch the famous version of the Dancing Plague get built, one hand at a time. We have already met the first hand. About 8 years after the event, Paracelsus passes through and supplies the first dancer her motive. The husband, the spite, the reason. The earliest addition to the record is not a fact at all. It is a reading of a dead woman's heart, written by a man who arrived too late to ever ask her a single question. Then comes the number. Somewhere not long after the dancing stopped, in a Strasbourg household, a member of a local family sits down to keep the family chronicle. The ordinary practice of writing down what happened in your city in your lifetime. And into that book goes a figure. More than 400 people, the family writes, were beset by the dancing. Many of them danced until they dropped. One family, one book, one count, written by hand in one household. And that single number, 400, is the source of the figure that nearly every retelling for the next 5 centuries has repeated as though it were the result of a census. It was never a census. It was one family's estimate of a crowd. Move on to a chronicler writing roughly 18 years after the summer, the same later hand that gives us the pilgrimage to Saverne. He sets down the civic response, the stages, the hired musicians, the city's mounting panic. It is genuinely useful, and it is vivid. It is also written by a man recalling, or recording from others, an event already a generation behind him. Reliable in its outline, no longer a witness. Now jump forward, much further, into the 17th century. A jurist takes an old poem about the dancing plague, a poem already lost in its original form, and copies it down to preserve it. He is working more than 100 years after the dancing stopped, saving the words of a writer who was himself nowhere near that summer. And the poem is gorgeous, exactly the kind of thing the imagination loves. Hundreds in Strasbourg, it says, dancing and hopping in the public markets and the alleys, day and night, eating nothing, until at last the sickness left them. Read it, and you can almost see it. But notice what it is by now. A moving, evocative picture of a scene that not one living person had laid eyes on. Pure atmosphere, a full century downstream. And then we arrive at the year 1636, 118 years after the music stopped. An astrologer, compiling a chronicle, writes his account of that long-ago Strasbourg summer. And into it, for the first time in anything that survives, for the first time in the entire chain of papers, comes the word that everyone now remembers first. There occurred, he writes, a terrible disease called St. Vitus dance, in which men in their madness began to dance day and night until at last they fell down unconscious and succumbed to death. There it is, the dying. Not in the summer of 1518, not in the council's ban, not in the physician's verdict, not from the family that counted 400 dancers, not from any of the people who actually watched it happen. The deaths enter the written record from the pen of an astrologer, more than a century later, who took a strange, true story that had ended quietly, at an altar, and then in a fade no one could explain, and gave it the most dramatic possible ending. He wrote the word death into an account that, in its own time, had never used it. And so the question that should walk out of this room with you is this: how does a detail that entered the record 118 years late become the very first thing anyone says about that summer? How does the youngest line in the entire file end up as the headline? So we are left with the real mystery, not how many died, but why anyone danced at all. The stages did not cure it. The contemporary record will not give us a body count, and the cause, the actual reason that scores of people danced themselves toward collapse that summer, is genuinely, to this day, unknown. There is no settled scholarly consensus on what it was. So the honest course is not to pretend we have the answer. It is to walk through the worlds it could have been, to step inside each explanation, live in it for a moment, and then check it, fairly, against what we know. And the place to start is the answer you have almost certainly already heard, because it is the one the internet loves. Suppose it was the bread. Those were famine years, remember, and famine means people eating grain they would otherwise have thrown away. Damp rye, stored too long in wet conditions, gone quietly moldy. And on moldy rye grows a fungus called ergot. Ergot is not harmless. Its compounds are chemically related to LSD. Serious ergot poisoning can bring violent convulsions, a burning sensation in the limbs, and vivid hallucinations, a body that seizes and jerks, seemingly on its own. So picture that Strasbourg, a starving city, eating spoiled bread out of desperation, and a slow chemical madness rising out of the granaries and into the streets. It is tidy. It is physical. It names a villain you can point at. It feels satisfyingly like a solution. And then you check it against what we actually know, and it comes apart in your hands. Start with what ergot poisoning does to a body. It constricts the blood vessels. It chokes off circulation to the hands and feet. Severe cases lose fingers, toes, whole limbs to gangrene. The medieval name for the affliction was St. Anthony's fire, and it was dreaded precisely for the rotting and the blackening it caused. Now ask yourself, could you dance for days on end on legs being starved of blood? You could not. You could barely stand. And tellingly, not one chronicle of that summer describes the blackened or gangrenous limbs that ergotism leaves behind. It gets worse for the theory. A poison does not pick and choose. It does not make hundreds of different sufferers perform the same elaborate, sustained social act of dancing. It makes them sick in scattered, individual, miserable ways. And it would not politely confine itself to the inside of one city while sparing the surrounding countryside that ate bread from the very same fields. But the deepest problem with the bread is the one this entire video has been quietly circling. A poison does not care what music is playing. If a fungus in the rye were the cause, then clearing the guild halls, hiring the drummers, raising the stages, all of it would have made no difference whatsoever. The dancing would have run its chemical course regardless. And that is not what happened. We have watched it not happen. The dancing answered to what the city did. It spread on the stages the city built, to the music the city paid for, and it eased when the music was banned. Whatever this was, it responded to human action, to crowds, to belief, to rhythm. A fungus does none of that. The bread is the popular answer. It is also the answer the leading specialists quietly set aside a long time ago. Which leaves the harder world, the one that does explain the stages. Suppose instead that it was the fear. Go back to that worn-out city, years of hunger, disease stacked on disease, and a population that genuinely, completely believed that St. Vitus could reach into a body and force it to dance, as a punishment, as a curse, as something that happened to other people, until, one terrible summer, it happened to you. Now take a single, exhausted, frightened, malnourished woman who believes all of this in her bones. Under enough strain, in a mind and body primed by that belief, the thing she dreads becomes the thing she does. She begins to dance, not because she chooses to, but because the conviction itself has reached down into her nervous system and taken the wheel. And her neighbors, who share every one of those beliefs, who are watching her dance the cursed dance they have feared their whole lives, are now the most suggestible audience imaginable. This is what specialists mean by mass psychogenic illness, sometimes called mass hysteria, though that phrase carries a sneer it does not deserve. It is not faking, it is not weakness or play acting. It is a real, involuntary physical condition, genuine symptoms in genuinely suffering people, that arises from extreme psychological stress and spreads through a community along the wires of shared belief. The body does what the terrified mind, at some level below choice, expects it to do. And this is the explanation most modern scholars find the strongest. Now notice what this world explains that the bread could not. It explains the stages. If the engine of the whole outbreak is belief and fear and bodily arousal, then a city that gathers the afflicted together in the public square, surrounds them with pounding drums and constant motion, hires healthy dancers to keep them company, and announces by its every action that this is real and serious and a genuine visitation, that city is not putting the fire out, it is pouring fuel directly onto it. The feedback loop that made no sense at all for a poison makes perfect, terrible sense for a terror. The cure made it worse because the cure deepened the belief, and the belief was the engine. And we should be clear that this is not a comfortable just so story invented to fit one strange summer. We have watched outbreaks like it happen in living memory. The most famous took place in 1962 in what was then Tanganyika in East Africa, an outbreak not of dancing but of uncontrollable laughter, which began among a small group of schoolgirls and then spread, school to school, village to village, affecting on the order of 1,000 people and rippling outward for months. Schools were forced to close, doctors searched for a toxin, an infection, something in the water or the air, and found nothing. The mechanism was almost certainly this same one, a community under stress, a body responding to a shared psychological state, spreading by contact and conviction rather than by any germ. Belief-driven outbreaks are not a medieval fantasy. They are a documented feature of how human beings, packed together under enough strain, can come apart. So is that the answer? Is it solved? No. And it matters that we say so plainly, because this is exactly the point where a lesser telling would round the most likely up into the certain. It is the best explanation we have. It is not proof. And the historian who has argued this case more thoroughly than anyone is himself careful about its limits, which is one more reason to trust him. The modern trances he draws on for comparison were very often wanted, sought out deliberately, welcomed, part of a religious ritual people entered on purpose. Strasbourg's dancing was the opposite. It was dreaded. It happened to people against their will. That is not quite the same animal, and the gap is real. There is also the deeper difficulty that a theory resting on belief and stress is very hard to ever truly disprove, and an explanation you cannot test is, by definition, not yet a settled fact. There is a third reading worth a brief, fair mention before we close the question, that the dancing was not an illness at all, but some kind of organized ritual, perhaps the remnant of a suppressed religious sect, performed deliberately. It deserves to be named, but it is, honestly, the thinnest of the three. The contemporary descriptions are of people in obvious distress, dancing in dread rather than devotion, and the evidence for any deliberate, chosen ritual is the weakest in the entire file. So what are we left with? Not a verdict. We are left with the most likely world, the fear made physical, in bodies already broken down by hunger and dread, held honestly beside its own real limits. No certainty, a best guess, labelled as a best guess. And here is what I would ask you to sit with. That honest, unfinished answer is more satisfying than a tidy false one, not less. The version where moldy bread did it and the mystery is closed is, in the end, a smaller story. The true shape of this, we know what happened, we can see the city's terrible competence, and we genuinely do not know the cause, is the more interesting place to stand. Because it sends us back, finally, to the one document in this whole episode we actually can be sure of. We saw exactly when the dying entered the record, 1636, an astrologer, 118 years too late. Now look at where it has ended up. Open a major encyclopedia today, the kind of reference a student trusts, the kind that is supposed to filter legend out of fact, and you will find the dancing plague described in plain, confident language. A number of them, it says, died from their exertions. No hedge, no, a later chronicle claims, no, we cannot be sure. Just a flat statement of fact, in a reference book, in our own lifetime. And here is the detail that ought to stay with you. The modern historian who has spent more time with this record than anyone, the one who actually defends the idea that some people died, who is on the side of the death toll, even he will not say it the way the encyclopedia does. When he commits it to the page, he writes, "Exactly how many fell dead, we cannot know, though one chronicle suggests that, at least for a time, 15 were dying each day as they danced in the punishing summer heat. And it is worth being fair to why he leans that way, because his reasoning is not foolish. It is the same sober reasoning this entire video has tried to honor. Picture what the record does describe. A population already worn down by years of hunger, forced into days of unbroken exertion in the worst heat anyone could remember. Push a body that far, he argues, and some of them, from a failing heart, from a stroke, from sheer exhaustion, would plausibly not have survived it. That is a careful, reasonable inference from the conditions. But notice the word, inference. He is not reading it off a death register, because there is no death register. He is reasoning from what bodies do under that kind of strain to what probably happened, and he says so, in the open, with the hedge attached. We cannot know. Read those two sentences side by side. The careful specialist hedges, we cannot know, one chronicle suggests. The encyclopedia, summarizing him, drops the hedge and prints the certainty. Somewhere in the copying, from one chronicle to a defender who says, we cannot know, to a reference work that says they died, the doubt quietly fell away. That is the answer to the question we have been carrying. The youngest line in the file became the headline because each generation trusted the one before and rounded the uncertainty off. And so we come back, one last time, to the one page that was actually there. The order the council wrote, in the middle of the worst summer the city had known, the dry rule about wedding instruments, no tambourines, no drums. It is still here. You could go and stand in front of a record like this, a real piece of paper, behind glass, in an archive, 500 years after the ink dried, and it still says exactly what it said then. It says which instruments were allowed. It says nothing about anyone dying. Everything loud about this episode, the 15 a day, the bodies in the street, the woman with the husband, and the motive, was added afterward by people who were not there, each one trusting the one before. The quietest document is the oldest. The loudest claim is the youngest. Which leaves one question, and it is larger than a single strange summer. If the most repeated fact about an event this well documented turns out to be the youngest thing in the file, how many of the other confident numbers we have inherited from the past are exactly the same?